stick to the questions, and really I look at myself in this for this as a facilitator of a discussion, because all of you know that the collective brain power in this Zoomland room is impressive. Far more impressive than anything I can bring to the table on my own. So really, I look at this as, I've done my best, since most of the books back here I've used to educate myself over the past 5 to 7 years that I've been doing this part-time, because this the comprehensive sexuality education that I do is more of a passion project. The teaching that I do makes about -$5 an hour because I take everything that I earn doing that and I put it back into resources for my students who are of all ages. So I'll jump right in, and hopefully you'll enjoy what I share with you today, and that it will be food for a really excellent discussion when we get into the questions and answers. Now, hopefully you can see me change my slides here. So this is okay. Did you see the slide change?
No, we don't.
Oh, you're not in share.
I haven't started sharing yet? I thought I was sharing. Okay, let me go back to, all right. So my first slide is just the title slide, but I love this quote. Age does not protect you from love, but love to some extent protects you from age. And I think it's a great place to start, given the content of what we're discussing today. Sorry, when I'm on share screen, it's okay. And another quote that I like to start with is, good communicators can contemplate their anger, their sexuality, and their opinions without losing confidence or collapsing into self-disgust. They can speak clearly because they have managed to develop a priceless sense of their own acceptability. No matter what talk I give, and no matter what audience I am speaking to, I find that sex and sexuality tend to be a touchy topic. And so I always like to start with those first two quotes to say, hey, this is a focus on love and a focus on the priceless sense of one's own acceptability in the world. I also like to start with the 5th habit, if any of you ever read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is seek first to understand and then to be understood. So I know that we're compartmentalizing our questions to the end so that this is going to be less of a discussion and more of a question and answer and discussion toward the end. But these are the questions that I'd like each of you to consider as we walk our way through the slides. And are you toting any sexual baggage? What I mean by that is, do you have any pain around your sexuality? That can be emotional pain, psychological pain, physical pain, and any other forms of baggage that you can think of, both figurative and literal, I guess, but really I'm speaking figuratively. Are you content with the sexual touch that you give and receive? And if you are not, why not? Are you content in your gender and or sexual identity? And we'll get a little bit into discussion of the continuums of gender identity and the continuums of sexual identity as it goes to romantic and sexual attraction. And then what resources do you need, if any, to enhance your sexuality? So holding all these questions in mind as we go through may help you to get more out of this talk. And by the way, I sent my slides to Alvin yesterday, so they're yours to post if you like as well. So when I talk about toting sexual baggage, things that I may be referencing that resonate with you are related to trauma, shame, body criticism, disgust, grief, regret, and then coming from some or all of those, you may be playing sex negative narratives based upon moral messaging, media messaging, and or medical messaging. When I talk about contentment with giving and receiving sexual touch, I like to break that down to talk about solo versus partnered. Now, solo sexual touch is usually referred to as masturbation, but I just call it solo versus partnered sex. And partnered sex, I will often break down into intercourse and outer course. So, and again, at the end, hold on to your questions, but if you have questions about what these things mean, just let me know at the end. And then I also really like to focus on pleasure-centric versus orgasm-centric or other goal-centered sexuality when it comes to sexual touch, because oftentimes we live in a society that, and I'm guilty of this as well, being very goal-oriented and wanting to reach for something. But if we can focus on pleasure-centric versus orgasm-centric, especially when the physiology of aging comes and gets layered on top of that, it can actually change things dramatically. Frequency of sexual touch. Are you having the type of sexual touch that you want as often as you want it or not? In what context is that sexual touch happening? And is that context pleasurable or not? And then what challenges are you facing when it comes to giving and receiving the sexual touch that you want to be giving and receiving? Are you content in your gender identity and sexual orientation? This is something that I taught a class on parenting LGBTQ kids on Monday night. And one of the things that came out of that conversation with those 20 parents was, number one, just trying to further their understanding of the continuum that is gender identity, the continuum that is biological sex, and the continuum that is romantic and sexual attraction. And I will oftentimes, in that kind of a context, spend quite a bit of time talking about intersex, because number one, in those parenting classes, the vast majority of my parents have never even heard of intersex diagnoses. And but it's a very, very nice example of the continuum of gender identity and sexual identity. And here I'm saying biological sex identity, and then you get into romantic and sexual attraction. So what I like to do is define LGBTQIAP2+, and work this into our conversation as we're talking about continuum of sexuality, since sex is one of those funny words that has a lot of different meanings. So L, lesbian, G, gay, B, bisexual, T, transgender, Q, queer or questioning, I, intersex, A, asexual, aromantic or ally, P, pansexual, panromantic, polyamorous, and then the number 2 is for two-spirit.
Oh.
So what resources do you need to enhance your sexuality? Obviously, there are a multitude of books and websites and articles and videos. There are classes, both in person and self-study. And at the end of this slide deck, I'll show you some of my favorites. There are peer support groups. You can seek professional advice, and there are some pretty amazing people out there doing this work. There are therapeutic modalities for those people who are struggling with specific conditions that may require therapeutic interventions. And then there are simple things that you can access over the counter without interacting with a professional, such as lubricants and toys and supports. this quote, and I may mispronounce his name, Dr. Robert Waldinger, who is running the Harvard aging study, says loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. And I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read this study or any bits of this study, but it is interesting reading. And I'm going to kind of transition, and before talking about some of the outcomes in the Harvard aging study related to relationships and well-being, I want to start with some of the early studies of loneliness in infants. And this was published by Dr. Harry Backwin way back in 1942. And the vast majority of, and this study was stopped early and was never repeated in the same way because it was horrifying what had happened to these babies. So infants who were deprived of touch and attention failed to thrive and died. And when the people who were doing the study realized what was happening, they stopped the study and intervened. But for some of those babies, it was too late. There was kind of a point of no return. And there are some similar works from the same time period. Again, none of the studies were repeated once they realized what the outcome was going to be, but there were some people that were studying around the same time. And so you can look at similar works from the same time period at the website that is listed there. Now on the other end, so we're looking at infants and then we're looking at adults who are progressing in age with the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is commonly known as the Harvard Aging Study. It was originated in 1938. It only included males, 268 male students at Harvard, and it was expanded later to include those men's offspring and spouses. And if you are into TED Talks, which I really love TED Talks, but Dr. Waldinger in 2015 summarized the results in a TED Talk, which is quite fascinating to go through all of the major findings. But I pulled out just a couple of things. So Dr. Waldinger says, when we gathered together everything we knew about them at age 50, it wasn't their middle-aged cholesterol levels that predicted how they were going to grow old. It was how satisfied they were in their relationships. The people who were the most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 were the healthiest at age 80. And I think that's pretty fascinating because with all the things that we're taught, with whether you're in clinical research or bench research or if you're doing psychological research or if you're a therapist, we know that our emotional and psychological health is very important. But to actually have other measures of health and well-being so closely tied to it and over so many decades, I found fascinating. I love this slide, but it's very, very busy. So what I did is I took each of the circles of sexuality and I put the content of those slides, each circle, onto its own unique slide. So we can break this down in a slide-by-slide fashion without me having to use my progressives to too great an extent, because I think it's kind of hard to see each of these. But before I switch slides, I'll walk you through and talk about these specific circles. So if you're talking about sensuality, intimacy, sexual identity, sexual health and reproduction, and sexualization, all of those things are overlaid by your values and the lens through which you see life. Our sexuality is no different than any of the other elements of our life. We all have lenses through which we see it. I'm going to take us to the next slide so that we can talk about each of these circles of sexuality one by one. So here are the circles of sexuality. And I started with values because, again, that's kind of the lens through which we see everything. And then we'll break it down by intimacy, identity, health and reproduction, sensuality, and sexualization. Values. What are your values related to sexuality? They may be rooted in familial attitudes, cultural norms, spiritual and or religious beliefs, science, laws, politics, individual and collective experiences. For me, I came from a small town in Iowa. My parents farmed for the first 10 years that they were married, and then my dad decided to become a minister. He had a lot of body shame and a lot of shame around sexuality, and that carried over into his parenting. So when I was pre or peri-pubertal, I realized that my parents were not going to be of much help. And I went to the library, and my best friend's mom, Mrs. Judy Harper, I still keep in touch with her to this day, carried around her neck the key to the locked cabinet in which they kept all the books about sexuality and reproduction. And they did have a section in the children's library, but again, it was under lock and key. So when my mom went back to school, when I was in 5th grade, I walked from the school, the elementary school, to the library and checked in with Mrs. Harper, and every day she would unlock that case for me. And that's how I got my sexuality education to begin with, because my parents, based upon their familial attitudes and cultural norms and their spiritual and religious beliefs, predominantly the top 3, really impacted how they were able to parent me and the information they were able to give me as I was developing and trying to figure out who I was and how to navigate sexuality in this world we live in. Intimacy. To what degree do you need closeness with another person? Some people don't need much, right? Some people need quite a lot. And once you recognize what that need is, how do you express your need for closeness? Are you comfortable admitting that you have that need and that want? So components of intimacy may be broken down as sharing and caring, loving and liking, and then this risk-taking and vulnerability. I really like that element of it, because in order to enter into any intimate relationship, you have to take that risk, right? It can, because there is some vulnerability there. You have to disclose who you are as a person, right? So there's self-disclosure, and that involves a tremendous amount of trust. Identity. How do you perceive yourself as a sexual being? Do you perceive yourself as a sexual being or no, right? For some people, they identify as completely asexual, right? The vast majority of people, studies show, are on a continuum. Again, there's that word, right? There is a spectrum of, very, very sexual to less so, or asexual. What do you view as the components of your sexual identity? Well, I always like to start with biological sex, female, male, and intersex. Now, based upon, if you try to look up the frequency of intersex, very, very challenging. So approximately 0.05% of the population may be diagnosed as intersex at birth, based upon differences of sexual development, just as with regard to the genitalia, right? But as the least common form of intersex, right? Ambiguous genitalia is the least common form. Approximately 1.7% of people will be categorized as intersex, or may be categorized as intersex. It's just that if it's not recognized, sometimes it's recognized at birth, but that's rare. Sometimes it's recognized during puberty, and sometimes it's recognized during the reproductive years. For example, if someone goes in for a fertility workup. But there are 40 medical terms alone for differences of sexual development related to genitalia. So we actually don't even know how many intersex diagnoses there are, because when you get into this, again, we talked about the spectrum, is that we're relying not only upon hormones. We're relying on hormone receptors. We're relying on each of those hormone receptors to function downstream of the receptor to actually turn on and to do everything they're supposed to do downstream. And this obviously, and then we haven't even talked about genetics yet, right? So if you're talking about XY mosaicism, right? So there are people who are XX with regard to their sex chromosomes in some cells and XY in other cells, right? XY mosaicism. There are also things like Klinefelter syndrome, where you are XXY, where you have a trisomy of the sex chromosomes. That would be another genetically based intersex diagnosis. So when you get into, I mean, we could spend an entire 30 to 40 minutes just talking about intersex and still not have even, you know, chipped off the first little flakes of ice off the tip of the iceberg. So I start there when I talk about identity, because this is often couched as a hard and fast binary, but is again a spectrum. Gender identity: female, male, non-binary, gender fluid, two-spirit, and many, many more terms. I spoke at Pride at Westview High School 2 summers ago and presented all my slides on gender identity. And no sooner had I finished than hands went up everywhere and said, you left out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because this language is evolving very, very fast. So no article or book or slide deck can be current because this is changing all the time. Gender expression and roles. This can be as simple as clothing and hairstyle and makeup, and then it gets more complex when we get into social roles and norms, both in individual households and then in other microcosms. Sexual orientation, which I like to refer to as romantic and sexual attraction. Gay, straight, bisexual, pansexual, queer, again, demisexual. There are many, many different terms for that describe sexual orientation. And I on purpose didn't include anything related to some of the early studies that were done to demonstrate with Kinsey and so forth, simply because I assumed that this group would have all that, but I do have other slide decks that include that information. And if anybody wants more information on that, I'm happy to send the original references. Health and reproduction. Oftentimes, as a medical doctor, this was the only circle of sexuality that was really considered. As people came in to see us, we were really focused very much on this, right? How do you care for your sexual and reproductive body parts, right? Anatomy, physiology, and then furthermore into sexual behavior and what are the risks of that type of sexual behavior? Do we need to look for sexually transmitted infections? How do we prevent those, etc.? Contraception. When do you want to be a parent? If you want to be a parent, how reliable is that contraception, and so forth. When I'm teaching middle schoolers, we spend a lot of time on this bullet point, just because that's part of the curriculum, but it's such a small piece of the circles of sexuality. I feel like everything else sort of gets lost. I already mentioned sexually transmitted infections, and then reproduction. Pregnancy, childbirth, miscarriages, stillbirths, abortions, either medical or surgical. And of course, this is always a hot topic when you get to political discussions, and this is not the course, this is not the one of the major sources of our, well, it may end up being one of the sources of major discussion today, but it always is a hot topic when I talk to the parents of the middle schoolers with whom I'm going to be interacting and doing their sexuality education, because they want to know, how is this whole conversation going to be handled? Sensuality. I love this circle of sexuality because it simply breaks things down to very simple elements that really span every moment of our lives. So, skin hunger. What sensory stimuli do you like? A lot? None, right? I've worked in group homes with adults with autism, both high and medium to low functioning, and sensory stimuli become completely key. And the most important part of making someone have a good day when you're there as staff taking care of them in their home, when you're working in a group home, can come right down to sensory stimuli. What they see, what they hear, what they smell, what they taste, and whether or not you touch them can completely change the flow of their day. So I learned very early on when I was doing this in high school and college that this is very important and very different for all people. Body knowledge and comfort. Are you content in the vessel that you are in? There are a lot of reasons that people are not. It can be due to illness. It can be to psychological and emotional reasons. It can go way back to the early slides, which the sexual baggage that we're carrying, right? Past traumas, etc. Sexual response cycle, right? Does your body respond typically or not typically with regard to the sexual response cycle? I'm going to mention a book and a slide coming up that is Come As You Are. Oh, I thought I had it right here. Maybe I moved it. I'll find it here in a second because I've got a bunch of books to show you the covers of, because I'm a visual person. I like to see the covers of the books, by Dr. Emily Nagoski. And she talks about, if you haven't heard of her, read the book, I would highly recommend it if you have a book club that's focused on this. I mean, if I had to pick one book, choose the Come As You Are book and workbook. It has a workbook that comes with it, because she talks over and over and over again about all the same parts organized in different ways. So you have a textbook way that people respond, in regard to the sexual response cycle, but then not everybody responds in the same way. And this is something I said to my patients over and over and over again, is that through my medical studies and my medical practice, I have amalgamated ideas about what the human body does, should do, can do, is supposed to do, etc. But each individual is unique. So my amalgamated knowledge may or may not apply to you as a unique individual. Sexual response cycle is no different. Fantasy. The role of fantasy can have a huge role to play in sensuality and as far as what you experience. And you may hear other sex educators say this, and I completely agree, is that the brain is the biggest sexual organ. Hands down. Sorry, my cursor keeps disappearing. Here we go. Sexualization. This is the one that always makes my throat kind of tight, because even though I have not experienced a tremendous amount of trauma, the trauma that I have experienced has left some scars related to this. So this is how sexuality is used to manipulate or control others. So this is media messages and images. This can be flirting or seduction, which one might argue are not negative things, right? But of course, it depends on the context, right? Withholding sex. One partner wants it, the other one doesn't, and there can be sort of some dynamics that happen here with that. Sexual harassment. It can be a variety of different ways that this can happen. B and I had a little bit of a conversation as we were waiting for people to join today. And, you know, she experienced some things that I'm quite sure would be categorized as sexual harassment, though she only used a few words in her explanation, and I definitely did too. The first time I watched a living related kidney donation at the University of Minnesota, the father of kidney donations, or sorry, the father of transplant surgery, and specifically kidney transplant surgery at the University of Minnesota, was there and was talking to me, and we were talking our way through the surgical procedure, and he grabbed my butt. I had done nothing to prompt this, and I feel okay saying this because the New York Times just published a huge article about him 2 weeks ago when he died. So I know that he was a really amazing person who did a lot to advance transplant surgery, But you can bet that I did not run to the dean and tell them that this famous doctor had grabbed my butt in the operating room, because I was pretty sure that I was going to be told it was my fault, even though, to my knowledge, I had done nothing but stand there and try to learn the surgical procedure for a living-related kidney donation. So this slide gets me every time. Incest, sexual assault, and rape. I love this quote. So this is Dr. Emily Nagoski and her twin sister, Amelia, wrote a book together after she wrote Come As You Are. And I love this quote: "You are the new hotness." The point is, you define and redefine your body's worth on your own terms. It's not necessary to turn toward your body with love and affection. Love and affection are frosting on the cake of body acceptance. And if they work for you, go for it. But all your body requires of you is that you turn toward it with kindness and compassion again and again. And every time I go through physical therapy and graduate again to Pilates and yoga, I think this: turn toward your body with kindness and compassion again and again. And the next time I end up in physical therapy, I will do this again. I played volleyball in college and I did a lot of damage at that time that I'm constantly trying to undo. Now I'm going to list some resources for you before we open it up to discussion. Oh, I misspelled her name, I think, here. No, I got it right. Joan Price. I thought it was, I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Thought, oh, what a typo. So books and resources from Joan Price. Hands down, she has done more for the literature of, like, if you call it senior sex, than any other single author. So she's got some great books. Some of them, not all of them, are available at the public library. I always check because, especially pre-COVID, I was at the library every single day getting books for all of my kids. They all have Kindles, but we're all still very much a paper books family. And again, I'll give you this whole set of slides, but Naked at Our Age, The Ultimate Guide to Sex After 50, Sex After Grief, Better Than I Ever Expected, which is one of her earlier books. And then she has edited Ageless Erotica. And then she actually has a video, which I haven't seen, that was co-created with Wicked Sex and Jessica Drake. The American Academy of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists was supposed to meet in Palm Springs in June of 2020, but it was canceled because of COVID, and she was going to be one of the keynote speakers. So I was really looking forward to hearing her talk, but that got canceled. So we'll have to wait for next year. Books and resources from Emily Nagoski. Again, she's extremely well-trained, very interesting, and I've included a link to her TED Talk, because even if you don't read her books, the TED Talk is worth it. I listened to Come As You Are on Audible. And as soon as I finished listening to it, I listened to it again, because she really does a beautiful job of breaking things down. And there is a Come As You Are workbook. And I swear, oh, here, I moved them onto a different shelf so I could read them more easily. But here's the workbook. And here's if you're a visual person, this is what the cover looks like. So, but excellent, excellent books. And definitely worth the read. I mean, if you had to pick one sex book to read this year, that would be the one. And then the book that she wrote with her sister, I haven't read yet. It's called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. And then if you are looking for sort of a curriculum to follow, the two best books I found are Older, Wiser, Sexually Smarter. And these are 30 lessons that you can kind of pick and choose from. They're all very good. And the interesting thing is that I actually incorporate elements of this even into, I take bits and pieces of all of the curricula that I use and kind of mold them together. So they're not necessarily just for older adults. And then this one is called Our Whole Lives. And the UCC, I think, came up with it's not actually a religious text. It is a curriculum for sexuality education, and it begins in approximately like kindergarten, first grade-ish, and it goes all the way through to older adults. And I own all of them. They're quite good. And articles. I'm not going to read through all of these, but they're here in the slides for those of you who are interested. Oh, and then this guy, he is my favorite sexuality educator for people who love science. They're called 5MI Weekly. He is a human sexuality instructor at the college level. And I want to say he's in Austin in Texas. And, but his work is supported by, oh, and I can't even remember who supports his work. It's one of the major psychological foundations supports his work. And these videos are fantastic. I really, really love them. They're quick, they're to the point, and they're very heavy in science. And they have all the original articles included in the videos so that you can further the reading that you may want to do. All right, and that's the end of my presentation. So I'll open it up to questions and discussion.
Okay. Let's thank the speaker for this.
Thank you all.
Hands. Okay. So the way to ask questions is, and Dorothy will correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, is somewhere on your screen, probably on the bottom, you have a thing called participants. Click on that. So you'll see a list of the participants at this meeting. If you go next to your name, you should see something, maybe 3 dots or more or whatever it is, that will, if you click on that, will allow you to raise your hand, okay? Give you a sign to raise your hand. And so that's the way you raise your hand, and you click on that, and we'll ask to, we'll call on you in the order in which you've raised your hand. Is there anybody who didn't understand what I said?
I don't have it.
Go ahead.
The three dots may be at the very bottom of your screen if you have a PC, of the screen share little sidebar, or they may be at the very top of your sidebar if you have a Mac.
I have no 3 dots anywhere. This is Ann.
And
And I generally do. I mean, I know what the 3 dots are. I'm just shocked that I don't have it.
it was changed for us when we opened today too, and we don't know why. Maybe a new update. I have 3 dots at the bottom.
Well, I see I have one hand that's up, but just disappeared though.
Uh-oh.
What happened?
Oh, I see it. I see it. I have it. Raise hand, it says.
Okay, so I'm going to call first on Faye Gersh, and go ahead and ask your question, Faye.
Oh, I came in a little late, so maybe I missed this, but so many of us at this age, 80s, 90s, are alone, widowed or widowers, and we miss the contact, the intellectual contact, the physical contact, the friendship contact. I'm with the Hemlock Society, and I worry that a lot of people come to us because they're lonely, and life has lost its meaning because their mate's gone. Any suggestions about what to do about that?
That loneliness and that loss.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's no easy answer to that. I have some really great conversations with a couple of different people in my life about death and dying, and learning to live after tremendous loss. I will share with you a couple of things that have allowed me to move past some tremendous pain of loss, though I can't say that I have experienced the loss of a spouse, because I married my college sweetheart, and we were together for 9 years before we got married, and we've been together almost 30. And I don't know that I will handle that loss very well. But I have a Zoom call set up with my friend Max tomorrow morning. We try to Zoom early in the morning on Sunday mornings because my family doesn't get up. I have 3 kids, and my family doesn't get up very early, and he's on the East Coast. And Elena, Max's wife, it's still hard for me to say, it's been almost 2 years, died of cholangiocarcinoma. And we were very, very close. And obviously she was even closer to Max. But Max and I get together to talk about Elena, because it's okay that, you know, we're still not doing okay that she's gone. And it's, you know, and the crazy thing is, Max and I have never met in person. I was friends with Elena for a really long time, and I never met Max in person. And yet he's the one person that I've been talking to consistently, not only while Elena was so very, very sick, and like when she was in a coma and so sick in the hospital, we would talk, but then after she died too. And we both support each other. So I guess the only even little piece of advice that I can offer there is that sometimes on that path through loss, to find someone that it's safe to admit how much you're hurting with, you know, and to say that it still hurts. But I'm not sure that I've got good answers on that. And even when I gave a similar talk to this one in the spring on Valentine's Day. And this was so right before the lockdown happened, and we had a hoot of a time. I'm not with you, you know, so I can't bring you chocolates and condoms and lubes and all the other things that I brought along, you know, to the talk, but that day, but we had a really, really great time. And that this very topic, loss of spouse and how to deal with that grief and that loneliness, I would open it up to everyone else too, to say, what advice do you have here? There's no, I mean, Faye, that pain is, you know, that's huge. It's a big, you know, and the loneliness and the hole that can leave in one's life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking not just of the acute grief, but the after effects. Just the fact that numerically there's so many of us in this age group that are alone. And I live in a retirement community, which ordinarily satisfies a lot of that need to be with people, but not during the COVID problems.
Right.
So a lot of us are very lonely, and I worry that it leads to people's wanting to die, and I hate to see that.
Yeah, I do too.
I mean, I think people should die when they want to die, but there's a limit. I mean, not when just because they can't connect with other people.
Right.
Which is sad, yeah.
Let me call on Dawn Bamber. Dawn?
Yeah, I just want to say, Faye, that's such a great question and such a tough one. I wish I had an easy answer.
There isn't one, I guess.
Dawn, can you, let me unmute you. Are you muted?
I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Well, I have a related question. I have various friends who have lost a spouse, either to death, divorce, or the spouse being institutionalized. And so the issue goes way beyond sexuality. How can such people get their social lives going again when their spouse had been such an important part of having a social life?
Well, honestly, what you're doing here, I think, is a tremendous, I hope that SDIS continues to exist, you know, forever, because I mean, all of you coming together for these type of conversations, right? For this type of intellectual stimulation and this type of connection with each other and this kind of communicate, you know what I mean? This is to me critical, but this is part of how I connect with other people, right? Is that I want to be able to connect with people, yes, physically and emotionally, but more often, you know, it's also about psychological and intellectual connection. So groups like this, I think, are incredibly important. And of course, you can list off, I mean, love in the time of COVID, right? You know, I don't know if any of you read or loved Love in the Time of Cholera like I did, but, you know, I mean, love in the time of COVID is very, very challenging. So some of the things that we would normally suggest with regard to getting together are just simply not feasible right now for many of us. And it makes it that much harder to feel connected. I mean, I'm going out of my way, even in all of my work calls on a day-to-day basis, to ask at least one person, you know, the first person who arrives, you know, how are you doing? And to mean it, and to try to hold on to some little bit of something that they said. So the next time I see them in Zoom 2 days later, I can ask them, hey, you know, your friend who was hurt in that cycling accident, is she out of the hospital yet? Or whatever it is. Because since we can't necessarily touch physically, you know, and I'm a hugger, you know, like I don't hug people indiscriminately, but I like to hug my, you know, people that I'm close to. And I miss that a lot. So again, Don, I don't know that I've done any justice to your question, which is such a critical question, is that how do we rebuild our social lives after the loss of a spouse or a longtime partner? How do we connect with one another?
I mean,
Again, welcome to groups.
okay, Al.
Well, your answer is a good
Oh,
start on the.
go ahead, Don. Go ahead. Don, you want to say something else?
Oh, I just said Erin's answer is a good start on the on answering the issue, dealing with the issue.
Okay, let me call on Al Karopkin. Can you
He
unmute?
needs to unmute.
Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Okay. So, Erin, there's enough here in your lecture to keep us busy for hours, but I'll just try to give you a couple of quick questions. One is, by the way, I want to thank you for your lecture. I thought it was wonderful and opens up a whole area that most of us probably haven't talked about here very often. So first of all, I filled out a form just in the last few days where I was asked, you know, give my name, address, and it had sex or some classification, and it said male, female, or other. And I knew I was in trouble when I didn't know what else there is. I suppose it has something to do with intersex that you mentioned, but I'm totally oblivious to that. Secondly, you mentioned about how it's good that we're all together, like it with this group, SDIS, and we have lots of discussions when we were in person and on Zoom, but I don't think we've ever talked about sexuality. How do you get comfortable with talking about sexuality among people our age?
Such a great question. Practice.
That's a great question.
Practice. And it's really, really interesting because my mom, every single time I talk, well, not every time I talk to my mom, every time I see my mom in person, she asks me, how did you get into this again, this comprehensive sexuality education thing? Because she said, I am so uncomfortable. And I said, yeah, I know. I lived with you for a while. I get it. I got a lot of messages during that amount of time that I was living with you. And then of course, throughout. So not everybody is naturally comfortable. I honestly don't really know why I am. Like if you would look at my background, right? Like you wouldn't think that I would be either. But over the years, I recognize that number one, just as an example, you know, I had a 50-something-year-old woman come to me when I was still in practice and tell me, I don't have a clitoris. And I said, you might be right, but let's take a look because my guess is that you do. But I could be wrong. So we got out a mirror and, you know, we looked and sure enough, she had one, right? But it was one of those things that she had not been comfortable enough with her own body to use a mirror, right? To find it, right? And there are more nerve endings in the clitoris than there are in the shaft and head of the penis, right? So if you don't find it, right, it can really change your sexual, you know, as far as your experience with sexual touch, right?
Yep.
So I recognize pretty quickly is that in, you know, as a doctor with people coming to me, almost all my patients felt very vulnerable coming to me with these questions, right? So I had to be the comfortable person in the room in order to set them at ease so that they could ask their questions and know they weren't going to be judged and nobody was going to laugh and that I was going to take it seriously and that we were going to come up with a solution that was right for them, or at least a step in the right direction, right? So take it slow, right? There's no reason to be uncomfortable with it, but to practice, right? And to find ways, you know, to practice. Not perfect, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it'll improve with practice. Hope that answers your question, Al. Oh, you're still on mute.
Yeah, the other question was about male, female, and what are the other?
Yes, and other would be intersex. So this is something that's kind of interesting. When you talk to the intersex community, and of course, I can't possibly represent with my simple comments the entire intersex community, but there is disagreement between the intersex community and the medical community as to how we are going to be referencing other, right? So male, female, other. So the endocrinologists call these disorders of sexual development. The intersex community rejects that. They say we are naturally occurring individuals, right? That we are not disorders, right? We don't want to be called, you know, the vast majority of us don't require any medical, some people do require medical intervention, right? You know, congenital adrenal hyperplasia and some, you know, things like that. You definitely have to interact with an endocrinologist in order to be healthy. But for the vast majority, you know, we don't need to medicalize different people. So the answer for other is there are a lot of different diagnoses. And I mean, and I use the medical term diagnoses, right? Just so we have names for things, but it is intersex is not one thing, it's a spectrum of things. So that's why they just, I think, put other, because I think there are even some people in the intersex community that reject the term intersex. I am not in between anything, right? I am who I am, right? So I am other. So I reject male, I reject female, I reject intersex. I am other.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start.
Yep.
Thanks for the question.
Okay, go ahead, Dorothy.
Ken had his hand up, I think, before I did.
Go ahead. And Ken, go ahead. And we'll go, Dorothy will be next.
Okay. So I'm writing a book about the autobiography of Giacomo Casanova. And one of the things that I have to deal with is that sexuality in the 18th century was remarkably different from the way it is now. And I really have made an effort to avoid using the kind of terminology that is used today, much of which you indicated on your displays. So I'm wondering if you know of studies which talk about, you know, sexuality in the past, right? I mean, it's that kind of ridiculous question. People say, well, was Alexander the Great gay? And, you know, the answer is nobody was gay before, you know, 200 before BC. It was not a concept that was alive.
Right. So that's such a great question. This question comes up a lot with my parents when I teach parenting classes as well, because what they all want to know is bisexuality a phase, you know, like, or something that is become not a phase, sorry, a fad. This is what they call it, a fad. And is my child saying that they're bisexual because it is popular right now to say that they're bi? And they want to know, what is the frequency of bisexuality across history? Now, great question, really interesting question. How do you study that, right? So you can, I mean, and I've spent weeks looking at various different angles of looking at this question. So in the internet has changed how research around sexuality is done. And it has allowed more people to feel that their responses to research around sexuality are truly anonymous. Therefore, we may be getting more honest answers. Maybe, right? You can look at this from a bunch of different angles. So that is one element of it, is that how do we look at the research that's been done since the advent of the internet? Then we look at how research was done prior to the internet being widely used. And then you're looking at, obviously, books, articles, conferences, do you know what I mean? The texts that are still available. And this is where the infighting comes. And I'm just talking now about LGBTQ, right? Given what, you had mentioned with, was Alexander the Great gay? So then infighting happens because someone who the trans community has claimed as theirs in literature, right? So this, person was assigned female at birth and transitioned and lived a totally male life. The trans community and the lesbian community claim that one person both. So then the question is, so was that person trans? Was that person lesbian? Was that person something, do you know what I mean? So it gets very, very tricky. And I took a course from the University of Minnesota Medical School that was designed by Eli Coleman, who was there when I was in medical school. And he runs their, I don't know if they call it human sexuality and gender studies, or if it has a different name now, but that course available free on Coursera, very, very interesting about how do we pick apart historical documents when it comes to LGBTQ identities. Does that help, Ken, at all? Not really?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of what I have to deal with is the idea of progressive history, which I don't know that you espouse, but I think it's implied by a lot of people, which is that things today are the real way they should have been, whereas that the social constructs we have now are very different, and in some ways superior, in some ways inferior to what people experienced 300 years ago. So I'm trying not to use modern notions of sexuality, but talk about it in the terminology that people in the 18th century knew it.
Yes.
But I just wondered if there were any places I could find other people doing that.
Let me take, I don't know, but let me take a note for myself.
Okay.
I'm sure there are. I just don't know who they are right now.
Okay.
But I have a couple people I can reach out to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I get pick Dorothy and then Jean.
Jean can go first. Jean can go first.
Go ahead, Jean. You have to unmute yourself, Jean. You have to unmute.
Unmute.
Yeah, you got it.
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the values that underlie relationships and sexuality. And I'm really interested because, well, for me personally, sexuality was always intertwined because of my parental background and my with relationships and feelings. Mm-hmm. And I'm lucky that my grandchildren share with me about their lives and their relationships. And they have very different views about it. And they're really incredible people. But they have this sense of, yes, you are, but you sort of hook up with people and you're close to them, but you can move on. And I'm really interested in how these kinds of things act out and how to work with them. I'd like to move closer to them in some ways. So how do you look at these values that underlie our sexuality?
So interesting. So 3 books. Okay, so 3 books that have been written in recent years about this very phenomenon that you talk about. American Hookup.
Ah,
Okay, very interesting way that I mean, the whole study that she did was very interesting, and then the research and then the presentation is very good, very readable.
the author is?
Oh, Lisa Wade, Wade. Sorry, probably didn't hold it up there for long enough.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So these are books that just may give you a bit of a perspective on what psychosocial research can demonstrate about, you know, the current generation of young people and how they may, and again, it's not going to be 100%. And then 2 of my favorite books, if you don't know who Peggy Orenstein is, she wrote Cinderella Ate My Daughter, and what's the other one that she wrote that I read, but I really liked that book too. But she came out with this book a couple years ago, Girls and Sex. And she also has a really phenomenal TED Talk. But it's all interviews with young people between the ages of roughly 18 and 25. And then last year, this one came out, and she's worked as in researching women for so many years that when people said, when are you going to write Boys and Sex? She said, I'm not. I research women. And why would I write Boys and Sex? But the more that she toured and talked about her first book, the more curious she got. And I liked this book even better than Girls and Sex. And I think she likes it better as a piece of literature. But very, very well written. And again, all interviews based on interviews. So I can't tell you if these are going to be roadmaps for like moving from point A to point B, but it may give you a different perspective when you're talking with your grandkids. For me, it was incredibly eye-opening. And of course, I'm a parent and a comprehensive sexuality educator. So I talk with a lot of young people between the ages of 12 and 20 about their sexuality and their values related to sexuality and the role of relationships. Because, you know, a lot of, you know, I mean, we're lucky enough to live in one of the states. Only 13 of the 50 states in the United States require comprehensive sexuality education that is scientifically accurate. 13 out of 50.
Oh my goodness.
If you want to read the law, AB 329 is the law that enacted this. And specifically for you, Jean, I'm required by law to talk about the role of relationships in sexuality. It's something that I would do anyway, but it's also in the legislation. Is that because obviously the role of healthy relationships, you know, Dr. Waldinger showed it, you know, the role of our relationships, right? And our impact on our health in the Harvard Aging Study, right? But those relationships are critical to our health and well-being. And then of course, being able to recognize if you're in an unhealthy relationship and being able to to safely extricate yourself from that relationship is also a really valuable skill set. But did I answer your question, Jean, about the difference between relationship-based sexuality and hookups? Is a vast topic. And,
yeah, I think, and I will look up the references. Thank you so much.
These are 3 great books to start approaching that question.
Well, it's all a learning experience for me, and I feel so lucky that they talked to me about it. So it's great.
My gosh, yes. I mean, and I am sure they feel very fortunate to have someone that they can talk openly with, right? In you. Because some of the students that I have, they don't have anybody to talk to, right? So when I tell them, hey, go home and talk with an older sibling or your parents or an auntie or a grandma or a grandpa, and then they come to me at recess and they tell me I don't have anybody, you know, and that's hard to hear too.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your insights.
Dorothy?
Well, I think that so many other questions have arisen while I've been listening. And I'd like to follow up a little bit on what Jean said. And when I was, a college student and then in graduate school back in the 1950s and 60s, that there were people who were experimenting with sexuality, and to a certain extent. And the question, if one of the first question is, how does experimenting differ from hookups?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure that there's a vast difference, right? Though, if you were to ask any specific individual, right, whether they were hooking up or whether they were experimenting, they would probably have hard and fast language to pick which words they were comfortable with. Like, oh, we just hooked up. And from what I've read about hookups, it's very much a, and I'm not sure everybody feels the same way about this, but in all those interviews, and Lisa Wade was interviewing all of these people about hooking up, meaning having a sexual experience with someone with whom you did not want to have a relationship with. You might know them, right? But then sort of the requirement was that even if it meant something to you on a psychological or emotional level, that you weren't allowed to show it afterward. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a hookup. So, and I don't know, and the people that I've talked to about, the sexual experimentation that they did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, do you know what I mean? Like, and I've had some people tell me about each of their stages of experimentation. They didn't seem to have their emotions in a lockbox.
No.
Whereas hooking up, from what I've read, kind of the rules of the game are no emotion allowed, which is kind of, I mean, to me, I think, oh, well, what's the point? But I mean, but, right? But there is a point, right? And that point is like, just like the physical experience of it, right?
Right.
And so trying to compartmentalize those things, I just don't compartmentalize well. So to me, it would be tough, but that's me.
May I ask sort of a second question? Because about 6 build up during the course of this. And one is, I'm still going back to all of the different types of sexuality that you were talking about. And some of them, I don't know what they mean even. But
Right.
then partially also, I wonder if there often can be a difference in sexuality in terms of who you're attracted to sexually, and the gender roles that you might want to take. And so I think I'll ask that question, but then I'd love to know what two-spirit is also.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll start with the last one because that's an easier answer than the previous questions related to gender roles and how gender roles may impact. I'm going to repeat it to make sure I got it right. How gender roles may impact romantic and or sexual attraction.
Or not.
Or not. Yeah. Again, those are going to differ by who you ask, right? Okay, so two-spirit is typically used by indigenous people, either Native American or other indigenous populations, who recognize specific people embody both masculine and feminine characteristics simultaneously. And they're often considered to be especially holy people, and they'll end up being spiritual leaders or medicine people within the culture. And they have different names in different indigenous cultures. And the best resource. So in January of 2017, did anybody get this National Geographic? Gender Revolution? And then they followed it up with a 2-hour special that was done by Katie Couric. And there's way more footage on the National Geographic website. But if you look up National Geographic Gender Revolution, they have a very nice coverage of Two-Spirit and of the Fa'afafine, who I think are, I don't know that I'm going to remember where the Fafa, does anybody remember where the Fa'afafine, anybody, where they're from? Maybe Samoa, I can't remember. So, but it's a really wonderful piece of work looking at not only gender and gender identity and sexual identity and romantic and sexual attraction, but different cultures' perspectives, right, on the role of people with non-stereotypical gender identities in the culture, whether they're revered or not. So that was the answer to Two-Spirit. Then gender roles and how they relate to romantic and or sexual attraction, I think is a very, very tough question. Because I think that for some people, if they are treated in a way that compartmentalizes them into a specific stereotypical gender role, that they would completely reject such a relationship. Do you know what I mean? With a person who did that to them. So for some people, I think the two are very intimately connected, right?
Mm-hmm.
For other people, they simply accept it as part of like, this is the way it's done. You know, I was born in a small town in Iowa. My parents came from long line of farmers. You know what I mean? When I was born, my mom had a specific set of things that I was supposed to be taught because I was going to be an Iowa farmer wife. You know what I mean? Like farmer's wife, you know? Mm-hmm. And so this is what you need to know, right? Yes, you can go outside and play baseball with the boys, but you better make sure that your gathers are even on this skirt that you're sending to the fair for 4-H, because otherwise you're not going outside to play baseball. So, you know what I mean? She's sort of what, and again, that doesn't have to necessarily do with sexual attraction, right? Mm-hmm. But my mom very much, you know, accepted her gender role, right? What she was expected to do. But in other ways, she fought against it, right? But I don't know that she would have even considered, you know, any feelings of sexual attraction to anyone other than someone who identified as male in that time period because of the rules that bound her life. I don't know if I answered your question at all, Dorothy, but to me, that is a very complicated question.
Yeah.
An excellent question.
That's why I asked this.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question and then I'll call on Al. Yeah, so I don't know how to phrase this, but basically, as a scientific type, I always get concerned about the inability of science to deal with things which involve hot social issues. So for me, given all these identity groups, and legitimately feel, due to past history or whatever, a sense of oppression and a sense of real emotional commitment, to what extent do these hinder or block serious research into the whole question of identity, LGBTQ, and all the usual stuff? You know, how can you do that, especially in a university setting? Probably, how can you do that in a country like the United States? And in point of fact, is it pretty much stifled as a consequence of this?
Oh yeah. So this is a great question. And honestly, what I'd like to know is I would love to be able to have a sit down with somebody like Eli Coleman, who has built at a major university, you know, at the University of Minnesota Medical School, has built a gender and sexuality studies department, right? An entire department. So my guess is it, so to break down the question, which is not going to be a pure answer, a pure and full answer to the question that you asked, because it was very nuanced, the question that you asked. But is it being stifled at certain universities and colleges and academic institutions? Absolutely, right? Because, you know, it's all, you know, we're supposed to, you know, separation of church and state, you know, is just one example. So we're supposed to live in a country where we have separation of church and state, but we don't necessarily, right? So they're going to bleed into each other, right? And so anytime you look at getting funding, right? So if you're looking at getting funding, say at the University of San Diego, where I go and guest lecture in their health communications department, right? What they'll allow me to say on campus at the University of San Diego is very different than what I'm allowed to say on campus other places, just as an example, right? So is it being stifled? That little part of the question, right? So if I go and talk for Sexual Assault Awareness Week at the University of San Diego, and I'm talking to those students, there are certain words that I'm not even allowed to say, right? I might be able to say every word in LGBTQIA, you know, but I'm not allowed to say contraception, and I'm not allowed to say condom, right? I'm not allowed to give away condoms. So I realize that you're talking more about identities, right? Than you are talking about contraception. But I believe that the same principle of what you were asking about is it being stifled at academic universities? The answer is probably yes at some, if not all of them, right? So then the next question on top of that is then how do we actually research, do the research if there are, you know, if we're being stifled in any one way? Well, you do the bit of the research that you can do, right? And then you build on it, right? Because I know that I stand on the shoulders of giants. Anytime, do you know what I mean? Like we all have these, you know, this basis of research on which we're able to stand, right? So you do the research that you can do. Then you asked a question related to, with all of this spectrum of identities, right? How do you actually do serious research, right? Where you actually ask very specific questions about various identities. And the best answer I can come up with as a clinical scientist is that you have to limit the number of variables that you look at for any particular study and see what you can say about that little bit and then move on to the next question. Break it down into bits and bytes. But yes, I do think we can do serious, you know, research on these various identities and so forth. I just think that the venues in which we'll be able to present the research, right? How the research is received will not necessarily, you know, will be different, you know, based upon where you present. Did anybody have a chance to read the article? I was just gonna, I mean, and this happens with even what we would consider to be mainstream research. Did anyone happen to read the article about the Northwestern researcher who was trying to explain the internal clocks of shellfish? Did anybody read this article? It was in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago. Anybody read it? Sure. But the scientific community basically didn't like what he was saying. So they blackballed him. And then it turns out that he was right. I mean, he was very, very right. And a lot of the scientists that were doing research, anything that bumped up against supporting his research, they hid. So they edited themselves in order to not be blackballed like he was from all the major scientific organizations. And I'll see if I can pull up the article before the end, or if you're interested, I'll send you the link to it. But it's really from a, can we do this research? Will this research be taken seriously? If we include all of these different identities, will it dilute it or impact the ability of other scientists to see us as serious scientists? Those are all really valid questions, because science isn't always nice to people whose research shows things that the community doesn't want to hear, right?
That's certainly true. So
I think Jean at Renshaw has her hand up.
let me just finish with a second question, Dorothy, or just a follow-up comment. Yeah, I see that point very well. but if the scientific community is going to be very sensitive to a kind of research direction that they're not particularly happy about, imagine an unscientific community
Oh,
in the
yes.
same regard.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll leave it at that. And Al had his hand up first, I believe, and then I'll get Jean.
No,
Thank you. So, Doctor, I've always been interested in the issue of romantic attraction, which you alluded to in your talk, and sex. And I remember, going back many years, but when I fell in love for the first time, I was very interested in this woman my wife, who I fell in love with. And, but I was also interested in sex. And how did I know the difference between, is this really love or is it sexual attraction?
That's such a great question. And for some people, the lines are so blurred that they can't tell the difference. I had the experience of meeting a person who identified themselves as pan-romantic, but asexual. So someone who definitely felt affection and even enjoyed physical contact with other people, but had no, if you could call it lust or, that sexual drive, none of that whatsoever. And initially, this individual thought that they were wrong somehow, that they couldn't really find anybody else like them, but was very, very real. So it becomes easier to distinguish the two if you've ever met somebody with the lived experience of having one without the other. And I think that people would argue that there are other people that very, very much enjoy sex, the physical act of sex and sexuality, but do not enjoy the romantic part of it and or the emotional connection part of it, right? So I think that there are probably individuals who kind of divorce those two things and then demonstrate how one can exist without the other. But I think for a lot of people, it's much trickier because they're very intertwined. That kind of answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Jean, you have to unmute yourself again, Jean.
Now?
Yeah.
I hear you, Jean.
Yep.
I hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up briefly on the question of hookups and experimentation, because as it's described to me, I think they're very much alike, because the hookups can last for weeks or months, or they can be just one night. But it is an attempt to understand, I think, the difference between commitment and relationship and sexuality, which they're learning about and experimenting with. So I just wanted to say they're not that different in my view.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because it's very lived experience is such a valuable tool to me in understanding all of the different perspective, I mean, and they're the same thing, really, perspective and lived experience. But as different people share these with me, I just learn,
Right.
and, yeah, I learned. So thanks for sharing that, Jean.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Ken? Is Ken there?
Watson.
Yeah, he's there. I think
Ken
he's
Watson, you have your hand up?
I don't see him on the screen for some reason.
I can see him on my screen.
Just Noam Chomsky was once quoted as saying, "There are some areas you should not do research because you may not like what you find." Interesting question.
Yeah.
Certainly true.
Yeah, you always have to be, you have to be prepared for anything.
Are there any other questions? Well, if not, why don't we give a big silent hand to our speaker, or at least unmute ourselves so we can actually give a
Thank
sound hand.
you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Erin.